All right, good afternoon, scholars. We are back. We are returning to part 2 of the ADDIE model, which is the design phase. In the previous video, I talked specifically about the first step of the design phase, which was the conduct a task inventory. And so now I'm going to talk about the second procedure, which is the second step that you all will be doing in your IDA number 2 for the design brief, which is composing performance objectives. So do you remember last week when we were talking specifically about instructional goals and that we were going to take those goals, do our task inventory, and then we were going to compose a set of performance objectives for our 1 to 3 hour training. So let's walk through what that looks like in this design space. Okay, so performance objectives. Of course, these are the things that define exactly what the training should accomplish in a more specific way than your instructional goals. Performance objectives are indeed informed by instructional goals, but they take it a bit further and move into the criterion, conditions, and measure of the specific objective. So performance objectives need to be clear. They need to directly outline expectations for learner performance and what they should be able to exhibit given a considered condition or component. And they are an intended result of the instruction that you're going to develop. So why do all of this, right? Why outline objectives for the training that you're going to develop? And that's really is because so that the learners, if you're sharing objectives with your learners, which I hope that you're in the habit of doing, the learners have a better understanding of what should be expected of them to learn during the training. And that the facilitator, just in case that's not you in this case, should know better parameters of their expectation for facilitating. Now, hiring managers or the client who hired you for this instructional design project, those objectives help them outline expectations for the trainees after the training is complete. And then if we were doing an analysis around the cost of the training and the investment on skill development of the employees, the value of objectives also helps to identify results that are gained for the investment in time and energy of instruction. So let's think about some practical uses for objectives. There's a couple of them that I want to outline here. And then, the first really is providing a sound basis for selecting learning materials, content, and methods. So your learning objectives are going to help you make some critical decisions when we get to the next phase, which is the development, where you're going to be actually developing lessons based on the learning objectives and conditions that you outline, which are informed by your instructional goals. So let's think about this in terms of a tiered system. The instructional goal comes first, the performance objective comes next, and then the third would be your lesson planning. Again, the objectives get you a bit into the measurement to give you a way to assess whether or not learning has been attained. And then, of course, they give the learner the opportunity to really focus their efforts and work toward accomplishing specific objectives. So the components of an objectives that are outlined in the branch book in Chapter 2 are really specific. So the first, of course, is performance itself. The second is the condition under which the performance will be performed or executed. And then the third, of course, is the criteria. So by what standard are we expecting the performance objective to be met? Let's look at these one by one. So in terms of performance, when we're thinking about performance and we're thinking about our Bloom's taxonomy action verbs that we're going to use to write learning objectives to outline what the learner should be doing. This is basically stating in behavioral terms what the learner will be able to accomplish when the objective has been met, right? It always begins with an action verb, and as looking at our Bloom's chart, so things like demonstrate, explain, prepare, apply, differentiate, calculate, create. Think of the example of creating a learning plan, right? And so in thinking about the example that we've been talking about with reference to the training being developed on the Delta aircraft. So if we were writing a performance objective for that Delta aircraft case study, it might start something like this. Identify all cabin service doors on all Delta aircraft. And that would be a classification of performance. Now, we're adding a component of condition to that objective, okay? So we started off with the performance piece, and now we're adding the condition. And that condition really describes the specific situation in which the performance occurs, right? So, for example, where on earth are our learners going to identify cabin service doors? It's not necessarily practical for us to have access to a Delta aircraft. Or I don't know, maybe you do if you have a client with some big bucks. But in this case, we want to add a condition of where we expect that performance criteria to take place. So we're going to use the first sentence frame that we used from our performance objective, which was identify, that's our action verb, all cabin service doors on all Delta aircraft. And now our condition that we're adding is in a simulated environment. So instead of going to an actual plane, we're going to use a simulated environment in the training that we're designing. And having that information up front is definitely going to help us design our lessons when we get to the next step. And then last but not least is the criteria. So the third component of the performance objective is criteria. And this is really where we get into our measurement, right? This is how we're going to be able to determine whether or not that objective has been met. So the criteria describes the quality or standard of performance that will be considered acceptable, right? And so we're adding that last piece to our previous objective. So the complete objective would be identify all cabin service doors on all Delta aircraft. That serves as our performance. In a simulated environment is our condition, and our last criteria is with 100% accuracy. So altogether, it's identify all cabin service doors on all Delta aircraft in a simulated environment with 100% accuracy. Make sense? A couple other things to consider. So the parameters of an objective. So when we're writing performance objectives, we want to think of these as sort of our learning objectives. And we are using the term learning objectives and performance objectives interchangeably at this point because most of the situations that we're designing in are not related to job performance, right? But they serve the same purpose, which is to describe what the learner will do within the learning environment. So for those who are doing more of a performance style on-the-job performance, there may be some differences between writing objectives in the performance space than the learner's performance in a particular classroom. And that has to do with the measurement criteria. And so the best practice is to think about the learning objective mirroring the on-the-job performance as closely as possible so that they can somewhat be synonymous with each other. And when we join each other for our next class, we will do a little bit of looking at some performance objectives and doing a little bit of critique in class together. And lastly, to wrap this up, just one more point about learning objectives versus job performance objectives. So in order to inform the best, cleanest design and set the parameters between learning objective and job performance objective, you want to think about this in terms of how could you design an experience to make sure that a job performance objective or a learning objective was met, right? And so this is sort of starting to think about things that have to do with the development. So an example of that would be like mock-ups versus diagrams, right? So in a job performance, you might want to use diagrams because you're asking them to perform a specific skill that could be measured by the accuracy of the diagram. And then in terms of hands-on equipment or any sort of demonstration, such as a firefighter's case, this would be looking at hands-on with real equipment versus looking at tools and video demonstrations, right? So the hands-on and real equipment with tools might be a job performance objective in the cases like the aircraft, and also cases of the beverage case that we talked about a little bit about last time, where in a learning or classroom environment, it might be more of a video demonstration. So just some classifications and differentiations to make. And the good news is that we'll spend some time in class in our next session writing performance objectives together and critiquing them in our space.